Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Margaret Beaufort. I feel like I need to start this episode with a disclaimer. Margaret Beaufort's life was fairly long for the time, but it wasn't usually happy. She did have happy moments of joy here and there, but for the most part, she had a hard life. So if you need to skip this episode because you're just not in that place today, that is totally fine. She was kind of amazing, but it was a long way getting there. Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443, the first child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and his wife, Margaret Beauchamp. At the moment of her birth, Margaret's father was preparing to go to France and lead an important military expedition for King Henry VI. As a noble child, if he died, her wardship would fall to the crown, not her mother. Women couldn't be trusted to raise noble children on their own. Somerset fell out with the king after coming back from France and was banished from royal court, pending a charge of treason against him. He died shortly afterward. Somerset probably died of illness, but there were rumors at the time that his death was a suicide for falling out of favor with the king. And poison is always an option, especially when you have been exiled. His only surviving child was Margaret. She was heiress to a considerable fortune. She was a very rich baby, a female baby, who was also the ward of the crown. What could go wrong? Upon her first birthday, the king broke the arrangement he had made with Margaret's father and granted her wardship and that of her extensive lands to William Delapole, 1st Duke of Suffolk, although Margaret herself remained in the custody of her mother. Think of it like William Delapole had legal custody, but Margaret's mother still had physical custody for now. Margaret was married to Suffolk's son, John Delapole. The wedding likely took place when Margaret was between 1 and 3, so she was still in diapers. She had no idea what was going on. This was a legal arrangement in order to get a hold of her money. And about 6 years later, when she was 8 or 9, Suffolk was arrested, and he was looking to secure his son's future. So he remarried them because he wanted to make sure that everyone knew that this money belonged to his son, because he didn't know how much longer he had. A papal dispensation was granted on 1450, necessary because the spouses were closely related. Lady Margaret and Delapole, her husband, were both great-grandchildren of 2 sisters, Catherine Swynford and Philippa Chaucer, respectively. You can learn about more in Catherine Swynford's episode. And this happened around when the second marriage took place. This is likely the official, these two are married because they're bothering to get permission from the Pope and everything. Before, it was more of just a contract. And still, it kind of was. She still lived with her mother. 3 years later, though, her marriage to Delapole was dissolved. They likely had never even lived together. And she never acknowledged this marriage in her future life. This was just like one of those things that happened and then it went away. King Henry VI then changed Margaret's wardship, not back to her mother as probably should have been done, but to his own half-brothers, Jasper and Edmund Tudor. In 1453, 9-year-old Margaret's wardship was transferred to Edmund Tudor, and Edmund Tudor then married Margaret on the 1st of November, 1455. Margaret was 12, technically the minimum legal age to get married, and Edmund Tudor was 24. He had been 12 when she was born. In her will, made in 1472, Margaret refers to Edmund Tudor as her first husband. He is the one she acknowledges. Under canon law, Margaret was not bound by her first marriage contract, as she was entered into the marriage before reaching the age of 12. I wish I could say that this marriage also was just a political marriage like her first one, just to get their hands on her money. But she didn't stay with her mother this time. She moved in with her new husband. It likely was a political marriage, but Edmund also wanted an heir, and he didn't care that his wife was only 12 years old. Unfortunately, that was the legal age of consent at the time, and her consent wasn't required in any case. The marriage was consummated immediately, and the Wars of the Roses had just broken out. England was in civil war. Edmund was a Lancastrian, and he was taken prisoner by Yorkist forces. Edmund became infected with the bubonic plague and died while he was away at war, leaving his 13-year-old wife a widow who was 7 months pregnant with their child. So it's cool. You can judge Edmund. I mean, ew, I definitely judge him, but Margaret didn't. Until the end of her life, she never spoke badly about him. And she made his son and his children her entire life's work. She made it her job to make sure her granddaughters weren't married so early while she was still living. She was a Middle Ages feminist, based probably on her own early life that was so rough. She didn't want her granddaughters being used as marriage pawns for the men. Henry Tudor was born on the 28th of January, 1457, at Pembroke Castle to his 13-year-old mother, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret's brother-in-law, Edmund's younger brother, Jasper Tudor, undertook to protect Edmund's widow, Margaret, and her baby, Henry. As she was not yet physically mature, she wasn't full-grown. She was a very small woman when she was full-grown, and at this point, she was not fully grown. She was still a child, and the birth was extremely difficult. In a sermon delivered after her death, Margaret's confessor, John Fisher, deemed it a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. Her son's birth may have done permanent damage to her physically, because she was married 2 more times and she never had another child or even became pregnant again. Years later, she enumerated a set of proper procedures concerning the delivery of potential heirs, perhaps informed by the difficulty of her own experience. Royal women after her would not go through the same thing that she had gone through. Shortly after her re-entry into society after the birth, Jasper helped arrange another marriage for her to ensure her son's security. They were still in the middle of a civil war. They were solidly Lancastrian, and she needed someone to help protect her and her son. She was still a child herself. In 1458, she married Sir Henry Stafford, a knight, when she was 14 and he was 33. I don't love that any more than I love the first marriage. It was a different time. They enjoyed a fairly long and harmonious marital relationship. She was still a child, so she was probably fairly submissive to him. So that probably made it easy to have a harmonious marital relationship. And for a time, the Staffords were able to visit Margaret's son, who had been entrusted to Jasper Tudor's care at Pembroke Castle in Wales. After all, women couldn't be trusted to raise noble children on their own. But she did get occasional visits, and she doted on her son, Henry. Years of York forces fighting Lancastrians for power culminated in the Battle of Towton in 1461, where the Yorkists were victorious. The Lancastrians had lost the Civil War. Edward IV was King of England, and this meant Margaret Beaufort, as a supporter of King Henry, was on the losing side. The king is not dead, but long live the king. We have a regime change. It is no longer a Lancastrian world. We have moved on to a York world. The fighting had taken the life of Margaret's father-in-law, Owen Tudor, and forced Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, to flee to Scotland and France to muster support for the Lancastrian cause. He hadn't given up. He was still a Lancastrian. He was the half-brother of the old King Henry. Edward IV gave the lands belonging to Margaret's son to his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who we will get into later. Henry became the ward of Sir William Herbert. Margaret was, again, allowed to visit her son sometimes, but they were heavily watched. They had, after all, been fighting for the losing side. But her new husband, Henry Stafford, was a trusted knight for the new king, so under his watchful Yorkist eye, Margaret was allowed on occasion to see her son, as long as she didn't put any Lancastrian nonsense into his head. She still very much saw her son Henry as in line for the throne, after his half-uncle, King Henry, and King Henry's son. In her mind, at least, he was the spare, as the king and queen never had a second child. But that king wasn't in charge anymore. It was a dangerous notion. In 1469, the discontented Duke of Clarence, George, the new king's brother, and Earl of Warwick, the king's cousin, incited a rebellion against King Edward IV, capturing him after a defeat of his forces. Now that the Yorkists had no Lancastrians to fight against, there was fighting in the Yorkist faction itself. They were fighting against each other. Margaret used this opportunity to attempt to negotiate with George, hoping to regain custody of her son and his holdings that George was in charge of. If George and Warwick were successful, Margaret wanted them to know she supported them, absolutely. But this wasn't going to be. George and Warwick flopped pretty badly. They had to release Edward back into power. But she was patient and clever and sure that God was on her side. The Lancastrians would return to power if she had anything to say about it. George went back to his brother, the king, and feigned regret for ever conspiring against him. I don't think it was real. But Warwick wasn't going to get off quite so easily. He fled with his family and made amends with the old Queen Margaret of Anjou. This would have given Margaret hope. Even though Warwick was the one that ousted the old king, it seems that he had seen the error of his ways, and he was back on the Lancastrian side. Warwick was able to restore Henry VI to the throne in 1470. Jasper Tudor was able to return from exile, and he brought 13-year-old Henry to court. For Margaret, these would have been happy days again. The king that was related to her son was back on the throne. They were back at court. She could see him when she wanted, and they could be open Lancastrians. This wouldn't last, though. The Yorkist faction returned and killed Warwick, the kingmaker, at the Battle of Barnet. Although he had chosen the winning side, Margaret's husband, Lord Stafford, died of wounds he suffered at that same battle, fighting for the Yorkists against Margaret's family. And at 28 years old, Margaret became a widow again. Warwick was killed at the battle and no longer able to kingmake. Until the Lancastrians regrouped, they would not be in power. Faced with York rule once again, Margaret allegedly begged Jasper Tudor, who was forced to flee abroad once more, to take 13-year-old Henry with him. She didn't think he was safe, and Jasper agreed. Henry was his nephew, and in danger as a relative of the old ruling house. It would be 14 years before Margaret Beaufort saw her son again. Henry fled with the other Lancastrians to Brittany. He spent most of the next 14 years under the protection of the Duke of Brittany. In November 1476, Francis fell ill, and his principal advisors were more amenable to negotiating with King Edward, who wanted Henry back. Henry was thus handed over to the English envoys to be brought to King Edward. While there, he feigned stomach cramps and delayed his departure long enough to miss the tides. He was also clever, like his mother. An ally of Henry's soon arrived, bringing news that Francis, the Duke, had recovered. And in the confusion, Henry was able to flee to a monastery. There he claimed sanctuary until the envoys were forced to depart. He was a resourceful 19-year-old at this time, and he wouldn't be taken out so easily. In June 1472, Margaret married Thomas Stanley. Their marriage was primarily one of convenience. Marrying Stanley enabled Margaret to return to the court of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. She was a Lancastrian, but he was seen as a loyal Yorkist, though really all he did was do his best to play both sides so he could always be on the winning side. But for now, the winning side was York, and he was York. Margaret started taking notes on how to play all sides from her husband. So, like the Queen herself, Margaret went to work on rehabilitating her image and securing herself a prime position from which to advocate for her son's return. Eventually, her efforts were successful. Margaret was chosen by Queen Elizabeth to be godmother to one of her daughters. She was respected lady at court. She assisted the Queen in her births, and her Lancastrian wasn't showing at all. She was now, publicly, a Yorkist. Margaret spent the next decade trying to look like a loyal Yorkist while also keeping the topic of conversation on her son and how sorry he was and how much he could too be a Yorkist. If he was only allowed to return, he would be no threat. She wanted him back in England. She just had to wait for the right moment, and that moment hadn't come yet. She had hoped that moment came in 1483. King Edward IV died, leaving his 12-year-old son, the new King Henry V. The king is dead. Long live the king. But that didn't last for long, because the Yorks were never good at staying united. The family of the young king's mother started arguing with the family of the young king's father about who should have control over the king and his regency, because he was only 12, and though 12 was old enough for a girl to get married, it was not old enough for a boy to be king, or even to get married. Boys had to wait till they were 14. There were visibly growing cracks in the York faction, and Margaret was going to take advantage of them. The winning regent was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, brother of the old king and uncle of the new king. Richard did not trust his sister-in-law, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth. For a refresher on that family feud, check out Elizabeth Woodville's episode. Richard seemed to have decided that it would just be easier to have his brother's children declared bastards, and he would just be king, even though that would skip over his other brother George's 2 kids completely. But there's reasons for that too. They had been disinherited, George had been bad, it was a whole thing. But Richard was married to the kingmaker's daughter, and he wanted to be king himself. And the path was relatively clear. All he had to do was get rid of his brother's children. Margaret was openly supportive of King Richard and Queen Anne. They were, after all, in charge now, and Margaret had gotten very good at blending in with whoever was in charge. Margaret carried Anne's train at the coronation. Seeking her son's return, Margaret appears to have negotiated with King Richard. She would have been on anyone's side who helped her reunite with her only child, who she hadn't seen in many years. Despite what these negotiations may suggest, Lady Margaret is known to have conspired also with Elizabeth Woodville, Richard's sister-in-law/nemesis, the mother of the 2 York princes whom Richard had confined at the Tower of London. After rumors spread of the boy's murder, it was at this point that Margaret began to hope of her son's fortune. Like Richard, the York boys were out of her son's way as well. She seemed to be playing all of the sides off each other, just like her husband had taught her, and she was doing it well. Margaret is believed to have initiated discussions with Elizabeth Woodville via a mutual physician, who conveyed secret correspondences between the 2 women. Together, they conspired to supplant King Richard, and by joint force replace him with Margaret's son Henry Tudor. Their solidified alliance further secured the subsequent dynasty by the agreed betrothal of Margaret's son Henry to the Dowager Queen's daughter, Elizabeth of York. They hoped this proposal would attract both Yorkist and Lancastrian support against King Richard. Think of it like Romeo and Juliet, but if it were planned by 2 adult women, so the plan was better thought out and everybody didn't just die.